My name is John Burtka. Yep. And I'm the Executive Director of the American Conservative. On behalf of our sponsors today, the Committee for a Responsible Foreign Policy, the National Interest, the Nation, and the American Conservative, I'd like to welcome you to our conference entitled The Future of War Powers. Before we get started, I'd like to say a brief word about our host today. The Committee for a Responsible Foreign Policy brings together people from across the political spectrum on a monthly basis to discuss the most important issues relating to national security with the aim of restoring the authority of the Constitution in order to create a more peaceful and secure world. In their own words, the Committee for a Responsible Foreign Policy believes that the United States must pursue a realistic and restrained foreign policy. Foundational to responsible and thoughtful foreign policy is the need for congressional consent for all acts of war. Too often, Congress has taken the back seat in directing military action, acquiescing to the president. The Constitution spells out in Article 1 that the authority to authorize war comes exclusively from Congress. Today's conference will tackle the question of congressional war powers head-on, with a special focus on the war in Afghanistan, among other topics. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jim Antle, editor of the American Conservative, and Jacob Heilbrunn, editor of the National Interest, to help frame today's conversation and talk about what you can expect to hear from our panelists and speakers. Jim Antle, editor, comes to the American Conservative after managing a stable of reporters as politics editor of the Washington Examiner. A former senior writer at TAC, Antle also previously served as managing editor of the Daily Caller, editor of the Daily Caller News Foundation, and associate editor of the American Spectator. He is the author of Devouring Freedom: Can Big Government Ever Be Stopped? Antle has appeared on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and NPR, among other outlets, and has written for a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Politico, The Week, the LA Times, the Boston Globe, the Daily Beast, Guardian, Reason, and the Spectator of London. He also serves as a senior advisor to defense priorities. Jacob Heilbrunn is editor of the National Interest. He is also a columnist for the Spectator USA. He was previously an editorial writer for the LA Times and senior editor of the New Republic. He is the author of the book, They Knew They Were Right: The Rise of the Neocons. Please join me in welcoming Jim and Jacob to the podium.
Thank you, Johnny. I want to thank you all for being here. Good morning. Welcome. I want to thank my colleagues at the National Interest, the Nation, and the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy for putting on this event and joining us in this endeavor. We have been blessed or cursed, depending on your perspective, to live in interesting times politically. And we have this dynamic where we have a president of the United States who has said in December that he would like to end the war in Syria and begin to wind down the war in Afghanistan. And we have a Senate that is part of Congress, as we remember from our civics lessons, and has the Article 1 power to declare war. And then the Senate rebukes the president for wanting to end these wars, which includes one war that Congress never voted on in the first place, and a second war that is our longest war that they are very afraid will be ended in a precipitous fashion. If we end it after 17, 18 years, that is highly precipitous, and we don't want to do anything quite so rash. Yet by the same token, we also have a war in Yemen that the United States is participating in, and Congress has rebuked, under the War Powers Act, it has withdrawn its support for this war in a reassertion of congressional war powers. And this looks likely to be President Trump's second veto of his presidency, will be to veto this resolution. So there seems to be some confusion about what our foreign policy should be and what Congress's role in war powers, in the matter of war and peace, what it ought to be. The opportunity, I think, that arises out of this confusion is that we have a president that wants to end some wars, even if he has perhaps not staffed his administration in the optimal way to facilitate that happening. And we have a Congress that wants to end some wars, or at least wants to resist things that President Trump does. So I think whatever the deficiencies of the Trump record, the Trump rhetoric allows Republicans and conservatives to have conversations about these foreign policy issues that were very difficult to have under, say, George W. Bush, when it was a bit more of a monologue rather than a dialogue on questions of war and peace on the right. I think that also progressive forces, principled progressives who have long been resistant to building up the warfare state and have long been resistant to the concept of forever war, I think they have been emboldened by the Trump presidency. I think that even if only for partisan reasons, they can gain new allies within the Democratic Party who want to stand up to the executive branch. Whenever a party is out of the White House, that party's interest in resisting encroachments by the executive branch is increased, is enhanced. But there is obviously a lot of long-standing reasons for why war powers, the congressional war powers have eroded, and some of that has to do with the political incentives faced by Congress itself. It is often better politically to punt on these questions and to allow a president to take all of the political flack for what we are doing or are not doing overseas. So I think some of the things that our speakers today will address is how do you alter those political incentives? To what degree are members of Congress really reading the tea leaves accurately and appropriately when they decide that allowing the executive branch to consume their constitutional powers, to what extent is this good politics, good policy, good stewardship of the Constitution to which they all swore an oath? So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the actual results of some of these wars that have either not been sanctioned by Congress or were sanctioned by Congress under a very different set of conditions than exist now that these wars have gone on a decade plus. So there will be both the talk about the constitutional process, but also the practical effect that this has had on our country in terms of whether it's actually made America safer, in terms of what it has done to the war fighters, the people in the military who have had to do all of these multiple deployments to fight these wars, and what it has done to our country as we debate what we want for a proper size and scope of our federal government. So I hope all of you will enjoy the programming and that we will consider these important topics, and we'll see whether Congress can reclaim some of their Article I powers, as our founding fathers very much intended. Thank you.
Well, it'll be tough for me to improve on Jim's lucid remarks, but I do think that the presence of this meeting here in the Russell Building is itself a good sign that the American public is increasingly wary of entanglements abroad. And these wars in Afghanistan and elsewhere are not popular. Among some of the elites, they remain so, or they are simply buried. The New York Times columnist Bret Stephens, a prominent neoconservative, recently tweeted that America is at peace today, which flies, obviously, in the face of reality. We are, in fact, enmeshed in conflicts abroad. And the Trump administration has also made threatening noises about engaging in Venezuela as well. So there is a schizophrenic quality to the Trump administration, where you have a candidate who campaigned explicitly against enmeshing America in further wars abroad, and an administration at the same time that has greatly ramped up defense spending, identified Russia and China as potential great power conflicts, and focused its energies above all in trying to deter and ultimately combat what it sees as a new imperial aspirations of China. So what is taking place today? I think what we have, as I was driving here in the Uber, we passed the James Forrestal building, and really what it reminded me was that ever since World War I, and particularly World War II, James Forrestal was Secretary of the Navy and the first head of the Defense Department after World War II, ultimately ended up committing suicide. But he drafted, together with George Kennan, the containment policy for the United States, which really helped to create a national security state. It converted America slowly but surely from a republic into something resembling an empire. Now, some scholars call it an empire by invitation, others dispute the notion, but it's clear today that America, progressively since the end of World War II, has become the dominant power in the world. And this is a title and claim that it is reluctant to relinquish. And the Trump administration, whatever it may say, has again sought to expand the powers of the national security state. Now, this has provoked some opposition in Congress today. We see it in the controversy over the war powers. Congress, after the Vietnam War, began to assert itself again in foreign policy. But the war powers, let's face it, are ambiguous, and no president has really wanted to accede to them. My suspicion is that whatever Bernie Sanders says today about war powers, that once he became president, or whoever it is, they may start to change their mind, because power is seductive and corrupting in the end. But no matter the proclivities of individual presidents, one thing that we can't also forget is that Congress has, in recent decades, also been an enabler of the national security state, particularly during the George W. Bush administration. And it did this in a mixture of witting and unwitting ways. The fact is that congressmen have been increasingly reluctant to vote on any of these issues. They have simply abdicated, both in the House and in the Senate. And it's more comfortable for the legislature not to have to take stands on these issues, including going to war. So what do we have today? We have a situation where America wages war on the credit card. We don't pay for these wars. We finance them through debt. Congress doesn't declare war, it carps from the sidelines. Let's hope that this meeting today can help provide a path forward to change that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim and Jacob. I'd like to invite the members of our first panel to come forward for a discussion on realism in Afghanistan and other theaters. Daniel Davis is a senior fellow and military expert at Defense Priorities. He is retired from the U.S. Army as a lieutenant colonel after 21 years of active service. He was deployed in combat zones 4 times in his career, beginning with Operation Desert Storm and then to Iraq and Afghanistan twice. He He was awarded the Bronze Star Medal for valor in the Battle of 73 Easting in 1991, and awarded a Bronze Star Medal in Afghanistan in 2011. He earned a Master's of International Relations from Troy University in 2006. Nathan Jerauld served in the U.S. Army from 2010 to 2016 as a military intelligence officer. He deployed to Afghanistan in 2013 with the 2nd Brigade, 10th Mountain Division. During his career, he achieved the rank of captain and received the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and 3 Army Commendation Medals. He is presently a full-time graduate student at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University College of Law. He previously earned a BA in Political Science from Hillsdale College in 2009. Chris Preble is the Vice President for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. He is the author of The Power Problem: How American Military Dominance Makes Us Less Safe, Less Prosperous, and Less Free. Preble has published articles in major publications, including the New York Times, the LA Times, the Financial Times, National Review, the National Interest, and Foreign Policy. He's a frequent guest on radio and television. Preble was a commissioned officer in the U.S. Navy and served aboard the USS Ticonderoga from 1990 to 1993. He holds a PhD in history from Temple University. Robert Borosage is a leading progressive writer and activist. He created a range of progressive organizations, including most recently the Campaign for America's Future, Progressive Majority, and ProgressiveCongress.org. He guided the Institute for Policy Studies for nearly a decade and served as a director for the Jesse Jackson 1988 presidential campaign. A contributing editor to The Nation, Borosage's articles have been published in Reuters, The Huffington Post, Progressive Breakfast, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. And our moderator, Colonel Larry Wilkerson, is a distinguished adjunct professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary. His last position in government were as Secretary of State Colin Powell's Chief of Staff from 2002 to 2005, Associate Director of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff under Ambassador Richard N. Haas, and a member of that staff responsible for East Asia and the Pacific, political, military, and legislative affairs. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our panel.
I'm going to kick this off. I finished a 3-hour seminar with my 8 graduate students yesterday at the College of William and Mary on U.S.-China relations and the Trump administration. At the end of those 3 hours, 8 very bright students were as confused or even more confused after the seminar than they were before. No one could say what President Trump would do with regard to Taiwan and a crisis there, with regard to a freedom of navigation crisis in the South China Sea, or for that matter, with regard to what the Chinese are more and more paying attention to, and we're not, our presence in Afghanistan. After all, it puts us with hard power on their, quote, other flank, unquote. The most lacking quality in Washington is empathy, considering what the other person is thinking about what you're doing. That's a military failing of the first order. The topic of this panel this morning is to look at what I consider to be 17 years of military and civilian failure in Afghanistan. But if you'll notice the title in the program, it says, "and other theaters." We have 800 plus military bases across the globe. The rest of the world, including Russia and China, have only 75, 76, 77, depending on how you count them. That's an invitation to war in every one of the places those people sit. If you noticed in the last hour or so, news has come from Mali and deaths there, over 130 as I understand it. Why are we concerned about Mali, especially if the terrorist groups there are by and large local with no global capability? Are we going to check every single terrorist group in every state and every theater we're engaged in, which is the globe? Well, to talk about some of this morning, we have a very distinguished panel, as you heard. And I'm going to start with Dr. Preble from Cato and let him tell us his views of intelligent statecraft realism.
Give me a stand.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Colonel. Nice to be here. I should make 3 quick points. I have some, I think, fairly basic guidelines for when the United States is called upon to use force around the world. And I think when the Afghan mission started in October of 2001, it met those criteria. Some of these should be familiar to you. They should be very familiar to Colonel Wilkerson. The first is when the United States sends its forces into harm's way, there should be a compelling national interest at stake. That seems fairly obvious to me, but it's not always obvious. Let's at least debate what those interests are. There should be strong public support for the mission. There should be a sense of related how we're going to pay the costs of the mission if it's expected to last a long time. We need to know what the mission is. What are we asking our troops to do, and how likely is it that they will accomplish that mission in fairly short order, or at least in some defined period of time. And lastly, just because the United States has the ability to use force anywhere on the planet at any time with no prior notice, as we do, does not mean we should. Force is a last resort and should always be treated that way. I think that in October of 2001, those 4 criteria were essentially met with respect to Afghanistan. So that I think that the justification for going in October of 2001 was correct. On reflection, I think that I need to apply those same rules for getting out of our wars. Because getting in is the easy part. It's the getting out that's the hard part. And I think today, in 2019, the mission does not meet any of those 4 criteria. It is not clear to me that our national security is advanced by the United States presence in Afghanistan. As Colonel Wilkerson points out, terrorists can emanate from many places around the world. Why is it that Afghanistan is the most important of all those places? It's not clear to me that it is, nor is it clear to me that having U.S. personnel stationed there permanently is the solution to that problem. The public support has collapsed for the mission in Afghanistan. Overwhelmingly, the United States, the American people want out of that war, and they have for some time. The costs, of course, are dubious, but we have the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund to fix that problem for us, so we'll just sign it off to our children and grandchildren. Nor is it clear to me what the mission is any longer. It was pretty clear to me that we were going to dislodge al-Qaeda and send a message to other organizations like the Taliban that might have wanted to harbor them. But what is the mission today in Afghanistan? It's not clear to me. I think it's important to keep these rules in mind, again, not just when you're going in, but also when you're considering whether to stay in, because despite the fact that the President said in his State of the Union address that great nations do not fight endless wars, we do. We, the United States. Of course, not most of us, because most of us are not wearing the uniform, but the United States of America is involved in endless war. We don't even talk about it anymore. The safest thing politically is to stay, because you can't be blamed if you stay for all the bad things that happen after you leave, right? There's the tautology. And that's what I think is going on in Afghanistan today. And lastly, I want to spend just a few minutes sort of reviewing how it is that we got here with respect to President Trump himself. One of my favorite lectures that I give is on the U.S. war in Afghanistan and all of the various things that Donald J. Trump, private citizen, said about the war in Afghanistan before he became President Donald Trump. Those promises clearly indicated a desire to get us out of long, protracted wars, especially the war in Afghanistan. Late in the stages of his campaign, he seemed to change his tune ever so slightly, and yet I think it's reasonable to believe that most of the people who voted for him believed that he was going to try to get this country out of that war. And today, I hear the White House and others talking about the promises that the president has kept to his supporters. Things like tax cuts and judges and rolling back of regulations and all of those promises. Promises made, promises kept. And I ask, why is it that promises with respect to war and peace don't have exactly the same, nay, more important impact? Why is it that we care more about those things than what we are asking our men and women to do fighting and dying in Afghanistan? If this mission cannot be justified by a clear rationale, it should end, and it should have ended a long time ago. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to Colonel Davis. I just want to say a couple of words. If you don't know about Colonel Danny Davis, you know he gained a little fame when he came back from Afghanistan and immediately wrote a piece that essentially said, and this brings back my own war of Vietnam, those of you old enough will understand what I'm saying. He essentially said in the article that the military and civilian leaders involved directly with Afghanistan were lying to the American people about progress there and about success there. I think that's absolutely the case, as it was for Vietnam. So, Colonel Davis.
It was July of 2010. 101st Airborne Division had sent a company of its paratroopers in on an air assault mission along with 60 Afghan military personnel. They were sent into the Marawara Valley, which is in the Kunar province, which sits right up against the Pakistan border, with the mission to take a specific town through which the Taliban were using to funnel troops and personnel and conduct operations elsewhere in Afghanistan. The people in charge decided that was something that was important to shut down. So they come flying in early in the morning. They expected several dozen Taliban fighters because the intelligence had told them that was there. And so they had plenty of equipment, personnel, and everything they needed to take care of the mission. The intent was, after they had taken this particular area, they were going to put the Afghan police in charge of a defensive perimeter so that they could maintain that gains, and so that way you would permanently cut off the Taliban's areas there, their routes in. Well, it didn't work out as expected, like often happens in military operations. The plan doesn't survive first contact, and that was the case here. Instead of several dozen Taliban, it turned out that there was about 250. And the fighting continued on hours, and now all of a sudden they don't have as much equipment as they thought. But then the heat turns up, both physically and rhetorically, and the Afghan military, who'd been trained for about 4 years up to that point and had trained with the Americans, decided they'd had enough and left. Literally just abandoned the battlefield and moved back to where they were no longer in the fire. Well, the Americans were pretty pissed off, as you might guess, but being American troopers that they are, they don't care how hard the mission is. They're going to continue to fight until they succeed. And sure enough, overnight they had got some reinforcements, both Afghan special forces and other American troops, and by the next morning they had actually accomplished the situation. They had attained the objective, and the Taliban had been routed and sent out. Now, it came pretty expensive for the Americans. There was, I believe there was 3 killed at that time and 15 wounded, and 1 Afghan that was killed before they stopped fighting. But we still have the objective, so now then we're going to bring in the Afghan police, and we're not just going to throw them out there. We actually brought in prefabricated defensive positions so that they were fully outfitted. They had communications gear, they had electronics communications, they had cameras so that they could see, in the dark, and they were set up with everything that you could have. After about a month, our troops left and handed them off in about as good a shape as it's even possible to be out there. However, almost immediately, rumors started spreading that the Taliban were going to come back in force and seek revenge on all of those who had been fighting against them. The power of the rumor alone caused the Afghan police to abandon the battlefield. They literally left everything behind. They took whatever they could, whatever we had given them, and the Taliban came back and did not retake it militarily. They just walked back and came into the position, and then it was as though we had never been there. It's very much the same as if I have a bucket of water and I have a powerful fist and I'm going to drive that fist into the water. The water is completely helpless. It can do nothing to stop my fist until I pull my fist out. At that point, the water goes back to where it was before, and you can never tell that the fist was ever there. Now, that was a tactical situation. On an operational level, what we used to call RCEs, Regional Command East, which was Kunar and several other provinces over there, which was one of the primary objectives of our operations in Afghanistan during the Obama surge especially, it's the same situation on a little larger schedule. So I spent actually quite a bit of time in the Kunar area, and after we left, and I believe it was 2014, 2015, when most of our troops left, and we handed the situation, or the battle space off to the Afghan military, they abandoned everything except for 2 bases. And I have a friend of mine, an Afghan friend of mine who still lives in the area. I confirmed, he texted me just this morning and told me that basically the Afghan troops occupied 2 of the bases. They don't conduct operations from there, they merely occupy. They can't drive there, they can't reinforce it, they can't feed their people, they can't bring ammunition, fuel, water, they have to bring it in with a helicopter. So literally they have 2 dots in that whole area, which was an entire division command area before that, and he said that it's as though you were never there. This morning, he reinforces that. It's as though we were never there. On the strategic level, it will be the same when we leave Afghanistan as though we were never there. No matter what we want to say we want to have accomplished, at the end of the day, whether that's next Tuesday, whether that's 6 months from now, 6 years from now, 60 years from now, if we want to be that foolish, when we leave, and it's a when, not an if, Afghanistan will become back to what it was, what it naturally is going to be. And that's one of the things that I just want to reinforce so much. And as the Colonel mentioned here, it really doesn't matter whether you're talking about Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, at all. It's going to be the same. As long as you have American troops on the ground, that fist in the bucket, there is none of these, organizations or terror groups that have no militaries, they don't have any Air Force, they don't have a Navy, they don't have all these things. They can do nothing to prevent us from having our fist in that bucket. But we're not going to keep our fist in that bucket because it's not in American interest to do so. We are not preventing any terrorist strikes from happening in the United States because of our troops in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, the operations in Yemen, Africa, all of these places. They are merely tactical activity. The military can't accomplish every one of these missions you send us after, and it will have no impact on your security in the United States. I cannot reiterate that strongly enough. Our security is not ensured here because of troops on the ground over there. That is the biggest fallacy that I think has come out of the whole so-called war on terror. Our security is prevented or is taken care of by our very robust ISR strike, what's called intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and the ability to strike targeted enemies who may specifically want to attack the United States. We must keep ourselves safe. We should keep ourselves safe from any terrorist attempt wherever it may arise. And we have to protect ourselves on a daily basis, whether it's in elsewhere in Africa where we don't have troops, whether in Pakistan where we don't have, combat troops deployed, or anywhere else in the world. We have to keep ourselves safe everywhere. But we do keep ourselves safe with this ISR strike and a good cooperation between federal, state, and local law enforcement officials. That's what has stopped scores of potential terrorist strikes throughout the years since 9/11. And that's what's going to continue to keep us safe forward. All we do is we lose American blood and American treasure, and we deny ourselves the ability to actually prepare for potential existential fights that may actually need to be fought someday for our security. We weaken our national security by these forces. We do not help it. And that's the primary thing that I want to get across to you. We do not increase our security, we actually diminish it by staying here. And we really do need to shut these down in a responsible way, and that will help our country enormously. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Davis. I would just add to that most of my military colleagues, and without exception, my colleagues whom I have trust in and whose opinions I value in the intelligence community, whether it be the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, whatever, agree that our actions around the world are adding to our problems with terrorists rather than subtracting from them. And it brings back to mind a comment that Secretary Donald Rumsfeld made during my administration when he asked the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others arrayed around him in uniform, tell me how we're winning when every time we kill one of them, we create 10 more. That's a real problem. Robert.
I turned it off. Hello. I'm here from The Nation magazine, and I bring you greetings from its editor and publisher, Katrina vanden Heuvel. The Nation has been a loud and clear voice against American interventionism for many decades. And Katrina particularly wanted to have a representative here because she is particularly interested in fostering cooperation between libertarians and the left, between Republicans and Democrats, to take on what is an insular and unaccountable foreign policy establishment and the endless wars that they promote. So let me just lay out a few propositions that I think set the basis for our discussion. As has been noted, we wage wars, our country, without end and without purpose. Afghanistan is the best example. 17 years, the general in charge now admits that there is no plan for victory. Think about that. The general admits there's no plan for victory. When Donald Trump said he would start to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, a leading Mandarin of the foreign policy establishment, Richard Haass, chair of the Council on Foreign Relations, rushed to print an opinion page defending the war. And he agreed that there was no chance of victory, there was no chance of creating an independent state. It didn't matter that it might become a terrorist base if we left, because there are terrorist bases around the world. But there was one reason, he said, one reason why we had to stay, and that was to demonstrate American credibility. Now, when the leading Mandarin of American foreign policy argues about the inanity of being mired endlessly in a war in an impoverished country on the other side of the world, that demonstrates credibility, my friends, that emperor has no clothes. And the war goes on. Americans, as one of our speakers noted, are tired of these wars. They keep electing as president the candidate who expresses the greatest skepticism about them and about regime change, and yet the wars go on. Obama failed to end the wars that he inherited, added Libya to the list of failed regime change follies, and helped perfect a strategy that enables us to bomb peoples in several countries at the same time without anyone noticing. Trump ran, as our speaker said, as a candidate who was scornful of these wars. As commander-in-chief, he summarized the enterprise known as the global war on terror as a waste. Quote, $7 trillion over a 17-year period, and we have only death and destruction. It's a horrible thing, unquote. He announced that he would try to get troops out of Syria and Afghanistan, and to date, the wars go on. The United States, in waging these wars, has developed and perfected a structure in place for permanent and constant engagement. Colonel Wilkerson mentioned the bases across the world. Trumpets America first, but at this point under his presidency, we are committed to defending more countries than at any time in our history, 66 and counting. We have troops in 133 countries, an empire of bases, fleets in every ocean, a military-industrial complex that is expert at inflating threats and peddling new weapons. We have plumbing in place, covert operatives, special forces, war corporations, for constant, quiet engagement. We have a foreign policy establishment that is insular, self-perpetuating, and has been utterly unaccountable for a series of repeated failures. And now, as I said, we have a mode of welfare that can go on without attracting public attention and requiring very little public sacrifice except for those enlisted to fight. The Congress has essentially defaulted on its fundamental war power, the power to decide whether we go from peace to war. But in somewhat, that power is outstripped by this permanent establishment of engagement. Few presidents decide to go from peace to war. They are faced rather with questions of whether we will escalate or we will retreat, a question that frames the issue in a way that makes the answer almost inevitable. The Congress, in fact, officially passed the War Powers Act in Vietnam, after Vietnam, in order to try to restrict presidential war power making. And yet, in that War Powers Act, because it assumed that America would be constantly engaged across the world and face emergencies constantly, it essentially wrote the president a blank check to make war, to create conflict when he chose, requiring only that he report it after a few days. How does this all end? How do we begin to unpack this? Catastrophic failure clearly is not enough. Iraq proved that. Absurdity on its face doesn't do it. Afghanistan proves that. Electing an anti-war president like Donald Trump seems not to work, at least to this point. And in fact, the irony of Trump as an anti-war advocate is that it has created a Trump derangement syndrome among Democrats, where increasingly Democrats are acting like a war party because Trump happens to mention that he might be for peace. I think the only way we begin to unpack it is first by exposing and ending the indefensible. The handful of troops stationed illegally in Syria and the war in Afghanistan. Surely progressives, libertarians, true right-wing populists, some Republicans and responsible Democrats can come together to begin to get this done. At least we could come together to force the argument and to expose the absurdity and to let the public let its views be known, because the public is on our side. Ending one folly would be a good beginning. We might even get President Trump on our side in a good day. To take on the full structure of permanent engagement, however, requires a massive citizen intervention, a true set of movements that disrupt what is now a very entrenched foreign policy establishment. That requires new alliances and courageous leadership. Moral leaders like Reverend Barber, whose Poor People's Campaign is reviving Dr. King's legacy of challenging racism, inequality, and militarism together. Veterans joining together to campaign against the squandering of their lives on missions that have no purpose. National security mandarins perhaps echoing Brad DeLong, Obama's economic advisor, who admitted that they got it wrong and it was time for others to lead. Perhaps the best hope for a glowing movement is the new generation demanding attention to catastrophic climate change, for that will force a fundamental change in security priorities and resources. The opposition is growing. In Democratic primaries, it was interesting to see that Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Gillibrand, Tulsi Gabbard, Cory Booker, and others supported Trump when he said he would take troops out of Syria. There's the beginnings of the possibility of a bipartisan effort to unpack at least the most absurd of these efforts. And surely we should get that done, for at this point, the wars go on.
Thank you. I'd like to point out that we're in the presence of the august body charged by the Constitution with the war power, and it is wrestling right now with a brutal war in Yemen. Senate has passed 54 to 46, I think. The House may be passing, but the president will probably veto. Consider that. The Congress overrode Richard Nixon's veto with regard to the war power. Nathan?
Hello, everyone. I want to talk about the realism of war. I became acquainted with the realism of war on June 8th, 2013. I was part of a small group that went down to a joint U.S.-Afghan base in Paktika province on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. We were there to share information and intelligence with the Afghan troops there, and we had a very successful meeting with them. They were very receptive, and I got to see the energy and passion that they had for defending their country. It happened as we were leaving. We left the meeting, went outside, and were about to have lunch, when an Afghan officer pulled up in a truck in front of us, hopped out, and began firing at us. I got knocked down to the ground before I realized what was going on. I looked to my left and saw my boss collapse to the ground. And it was when I went to grab my rifle that I realized that something wasn't right. And the pool of blood started emerging from my arm on the ground. Once the screaming and bullet fire stopped, I went to grab my tourniquet and put it on, and one of the Afghan translators there helped me tighten it. Some of my brothers and sisters in arms came over to pick me up, put me in the back of a truck to take me to a medic station. Before I left, they handed me a rifle to pull security in the truck, and they loaded a bloodied body of one of my fellow soldiers on the back of that truck as we drove off back to the medic station. I say all this because experiencing that was not the hardest part of war. It's dealing with the aftermath of that every day for the rest of your life. And this is why, when we talk about the future of war powers and the realism of war in general, we must always consider our firm commitment to veteran services and ensuring that veterans have access to appropriate care. And I think I recently wrote about this in The Atlantic. And I think that as a society, we oftentimes forget that this is an important component of that discussion. And I think it's a symptom of the civil-military divide. Society desires to help veterans, but they don't always understand what veterans need. And veterans as a whole generally don't talk about some of their key interests and their needs. And I think I wrote about a recent proposal in the Afghan Service Act, which is likely going to be discussed today. They want to provide a $2,500 cash bonus to veterans to honor their service in Afghanistan. The total amount that'll be proposed that's going to be spent is $7 billion. I took great issue with that because there are real, ascertainable, and pressing issues facing veterans as a whole that $7 billion could do a lot more benefit for than a $2,500 check in the mail. Right now, we have over 140,000 soldiers that have volunteered to list themselves on the burn pit registry to articulate what they saw and experienced overseas in hopes that someday science might provide help to those that are suffering cancers and other terrible diseases that they will have to live with for the rest of their life. And it's unclear now that because the VA doesn't recognize a scientific link between burn pits and these various conditions that have been popping up, there's no guarantee that those of us that get out early, have families, will get any compensation for our families after our passing. We also have a severe problem with lead, mold, and other infestations on our military bases. I was saddened to learn that between 2011 and I think 2018, there are over 1,000 cases of small children with elevated lead that are military kids. We also have a severe problem in our Court of Appeals system for veteran claims. The Board of Veteran Appeals last year heard 85,000 cases, That means on a given week, judges have to work through 25 to 30 cases a week. Oftentimes, these cases for disability claims have over 1,000 pages. And a recent study by Stanford scholars identified a high error rate among the decisions being made. I'm not an expert. I am a veteran here to talk about things that I saw and that need to be addressed. If we are wanting to preserve the all-volunteer force, if we want to continue incentivizing our young men and women to join the ranks of our military, we must do better for our veterans. If we want to honor the sacrifices of those that have died, shed blood for those for our country and our interests, we must do better for our veterans. We can never forget that whenever we talk about the impact of intervention and taking military action. Thank you.
First thing I want to do is thank the panel for doing something I rarely encounter, staying on schedule. So now we have time for questions from you, roughly a half an hour for it. I want to ask the first, Mitzi, I'll be right to you. I want to ask the first one of the panel and just ask them to take into consideration not just the Afghanistan part of the title, but also the other theaters part, and give us a little shot of what you think would be a realistic, intelligent, wise statecraft that America should adopt were it to suddenly come to its senses.
Well, I think that it has to begin with an appreciation for all of the instruments of American power and influence. And responsible, intelligent statecraft does not begin and end at the barrel of a rifle, right? So I think that if you look at the range of things that the United States has undertaken since 9/11, the military instrument is the least effective of them. And let me hasten to add, this is not the fault of the men and women who carry these rifles. Absolutely not. They have been put into positions to accomplish missions that they simply were not suited to in the first place. Now, to their great credit, as Colonel Davis pointed out, they don't often say that, right? They are trained to carry out orders that are given to them and figure it out, and God bless them for it. But ultimately, the responsibility rests with the civilian leaders that put them into these situations in the first place. So I would do this. I would start by sunsetting the 2001 and 2002 authorizations to use military force. End them, don't mend them. Require Congress to come back and debate, as though we were starting from scratch, where U.S. military personnel should be deployed and why. And if the administration cannot demonstrate that, then there should be no forces engaged in conflict. That would be a start, but we're still a long way away from that.
I would actually build on to that. And I've actually heard it floated around by a number of my colleagues actually prior to the last election, is that they would like to see a situation where the commander-in-chief says, okay, there is, depending on how you want to count, roughly 9 undeclared wars right now, military operations where we're carrying on that have not been authorized. Take every one of those and say, all right, in order, in sequence, give them to Congress. If Congress really does believe that they are in the national interest and that they are necessary for our security, then let them vote and the operation will continue. If they don't, then the operation will shut down. Now, of course, in my opinion, there's very strong, compelling evidence that none of them would pass that muster. Because if you're going to have a military operation, part of that calculation must be, and how do we end this? You know, the classic ends, ways, and means. What is the end state? How do we even achieve it? And right now, those don't even exist for Afghanistan, and certainly not for Syria or in Iraq. They're just there, and anywhere in Africa that you want to talk about. They just exist to conduct tactical operations. But there's not even the possibility, there's nothing even articulated that would ever tell the American people, here's how we'll know when this wins. When these conditions are met, then we know we have success. And if you can't articulate that, and if you can't even start the first one, which is, why is this in the American national interest? Why do we need, and that's the word that has to be applied, why do we need to conduct these military operations for our security? If you can't answer that one or the last one, they must end. And if we just use a rational approach on all of these, I think that we'll do a lot less in the military sphere.
Well, I second my colleagues. Let me add two things. One is, I do believe we need a fundamental reassessment of what our national security threats are. I think increasingly it is clear to people that the existential threat we face from catastrophic climate change is real, present, and costly in lives and treasure right now, and is getting significantly worse. It requires fundamental reordering of our security priorities in perspective and energy. Secondly, we have an international economy and an international economic strategy that is undermining our middle class and producing inequality and fostering corruption across the world and in this country. That is something that will continue to disrupt our politics and make us a much less safe country. I think we have to make that a national security priority. Then I think my colleagues, I would join my colleagues, what Colonel Davis said earlier about ending the militarization of the global war on terror, I think is fundamental. It's been a fundamental mistake. It has led us to do what every politician of every party and of every political stripe says we will not do, which is try to police the world. And I can assure you that no country, even one as powerful as the United States, can police the world, yet that is essentially what we are about, and we must begin to unpack that.
I think we need to remember that military force is just one of our powers as a nation. We have diplomacy, we have information, we have economic means. And that we can achieve these objectives only through unity of all efforts toward a defined, clear goal. And I think that in the future, if we ever endeavor again to take on nation building, we have got to really think through what the consequences of our actions and have a plan in place to address what will happen after a quote-unquote military victory happens. I think we also need to look at what role the State Department serves. In the future, we must look at further integration of military and State Department efforts because the State Department are subject matter experts on diplomacy. They are people to go to about how do we set up an effective government and help them provide essential services overseas. And I'd like to see more collaboration between the two departments and potentially set up some type of State Department expeditionary force to collaborate with the military if we ever endeavor to do something like this again.
Thank you all. Mitzi, you were first.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School now, but I actually got the energy conversation going back in the Defense Department when they became the leaders. So I was thrilled to hear what you had to say about energy being the real crisis. My question to all of you is, how are you going to organize? By the way, this was brilliant. How are you going to organize to get your stories throughout the entire country? And I think you have to build a publicity campaign. You have to figure out how to do it. But the country needs to hear what we've been privileged to hear this morning.
Anybody want to tackle that?
I'll start. I'm having a bit of a Groundhog Day moment right now. because as I walked into this room a little while ago, I realized that I had participated in a discussion on Afghanistan in this very room about 10 years ago, which is all a way of saying what I've been doing for the last 10 years clearly isn't working. You know you've been in this game too long when you have to Google to find out when you gave a talk. No, I don't recommend that. Anyway, here's my recommendation. For better or for worse, and I think that it is a double-edged sword, the public pays attention when former military people say it. When there is a bipartisan bill introduced on the floor of the Senate, we will hear from Senators Paul and Udall in a bit. When they introduce something on the floor of the Senate, it gets a little bit of attention. When Concerned Veterans for America and Vote Vets get together, it's the front page of the New York Times. Now, I'm not sure that I like that. In fact, I'm pretty sure that I don't like that, but it is what it is. So we just have to accept reality. And I think it's very exciting. I think Bob alluded to this as well. I think it's very exciting that two veterans organizations who disagree on many things can agree on this one very important thing. And we should see more of those sorts of coalitions.
And I would just add that issues like that, or events like this, I mean, they do help. And what Senators Paul and his colleagues are doing also helps. And if we continue to take it out of this room and use social media to get it out there any way that you can to show how rational and sane and realistic are the things that are being advocated here, and how virtually the polar opposite are the things that we're doing. And I've heard it said recently, and certainly it seems to be the case, that that the Congress seems to be many years typically behind what the American people actually think. And we've seen poll after poll by different organizations that show the overwhelming and growing belief that what we're saying represents what the most Americans actually believe and think too. And if we can just bring those two together a little quicker, then I think it would be benefit for the whole country.
I'd like to just add that in the last decade that you've been looking at, I've been in all 50 states. And I've spoken on college campuses and at Rotary clubs and everything else, and I deliver this message. And I was at Angelo State University in Texas last week at an all-volunteer force forum with a lot of veterans and a lot of scholars who study the U.S. military. And we all agreed and put it up on the board so everyone in the audience could see it, that we had a dozen issues that the American people had clearly indicated in poll after poll that they wanted the Congress to act on. Everything from gun control to now climate change. And then we asked the question, why has not that august body of the people's representatives done what clearly you have told them to do? Because they haven't. Next question, please.
Colonel.
Good morning, all. Thank you very much, and thank you to our veterans on the panel for your service, and clearly in many examples, outright heroism. My name is Connor Clark. I'm a graduate student at University of Maryland, and I'm finishing up a job with the National Guard Association down the street. I wanted to ask about some of the more populist-seeming proposals to constrain Congress from war, appropriations, decisions, lack of restraint based on constraints of self-interest. There seem to be these things that float around saying if deficits rise above 3%, all congressional officials are ineligible for re-election, and things, or even things like you should not be allowed to vote for war unless you have served, or another one. If you vote for a war, your kids are first to be drafted. I mean, these things, very simplistic, but I can't help but wonder if in this, they have this kernel of truth, are there realistic constraints on self-interest of Congress? Is there something that can be crafted that really does, I don't want to say has a great chance of passing, but are there things that can be proposed and enacted to shape the conversation that's a bit more productive and actually would work within the constitutional framework without raising, the ethical question of favoring certain kids for the draft? Thank you.
I'm going to let the panel take that question, but I'm going to say two things right off the bat. This is the consensus we came to at Angelo State University: a war tax and conscription. Questions or comments?
So I think I wouldn't be in favor of a requirement imposed on all Congress members. I think really what this boils down to is that we, the people, have to recognize what we want. And I think, too, is that some of the things that you're talking about are also symptomatic of this civil-military divide of there's just a lack of understanding nowadays between our civilian side and the military side. I think there was a recent poll by the DoD in 2014 that showed half of our youth couldn't name all the military branches. You are less likely now also to be able to have a family member that is a military member. So I think we are, in a sense, the military is kind of becoming becoming mythical folk heroes because we lack a physical connection to people. And I think that's not the right answer. I think that we are all human beings. We are all citizens, and we're just trying to do the best we can. And I think that ultimately we just need to look at, and I like the proposals of, I think we as a people, when we're at war, we need to feel a connection to war. I mean, because I think one of the greatest criticisms I hear from veterans about this war in Afghanistan is as the forgotten war. I think the quote earlier that was mentioned about, America is at peace right now. Meanwhile, we have thousands of troops around the world, right? In some sense, we might as well be deployed on the moon because there's no real connection to that. And I think in Vietnam, for example, they had the draft where someone's neighbor was drafted, someone's cousin was drafted. It was on the news every day. So I think having a greater connection, fostering a greater connection would be one mechanism I would be in favor of, but I think as a whole, the people themselves need to invest in understanding this issue.
Let me just add money in politics. If you want to make one basic reform in Congress, you have to limit the influence of big money in lobbies here in Washington and in campaign contributions generally. Now, interestingly, that's beginning to happen in sort of a de facto way. Certainly at the presidential level, increasingly candidates can be viable with small donations, or great fortunes like Trump had, which gives them independence from the entrenched interests that stand in the way of Colonel Wilkerson's agenda in Texas. And if that starts to apply to congressional races, if you could pass a public matching grant for small donations for congressional races, you would see Congress much more able to reflect the interests of its citizens rather than the interests of its entrenched interests. Thanks.
Where's the mic?
Thank you. Paul Gallagher with the Executive Intelligence Review. I just wanted to raise that the arguments that you have made, although I certainly agree with almost all of them, are negative. They address themselves to a few of the wars in which we're involved, and they should be ended. But there's a broader context here. The target of confrontation in these wars, for the most part, is Iran and Russia, and above all, Russia. We've just been through 3 years of intense attempts to prevent President Trump from what seemed to be an intention to cooperate with Russia, and instead to make him confront Russia along with all of the neocons and everybody else. In Syria, we're confronting Iran and Russia. And the argument for keeping the troops there, if they even make an argument, is that. So what I would like to pose is that you're not going to end this endless war-fighting policy except by a development policy which involves cooperation with Russia and with China, as the president at least had some apparent intention to do, in not only a new strategic concept ending these wars, but also development efforts in these countries, joint infrastructure development efforts in these countries. I mean, if you look at Korea, where Trump has...
Is there a question coming?
That's the question. I'm saying, isn't this necessary, including cooperation in space? The young man mentioned the moon. Why shouldn't some of those soldiers wind up among explorers on the moon? This is another thing which requires international cooperation with the other spacefaring powers. And that kind of a policy, credit and development policy in cooperation, is the antithesis of a policy of fighting wars in order to eventually confront Russia, including in Ukraine.
I think you've described some portion of intelligence statecraft, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think that there's something even more fundamental necessary before even any of those things should even be contemplated, and that's that we need a change of mentality. We barely escaped thinking that we won the Cold War and that we were now obligated or due to kind of lord it over everybody else before 9/11 happened, and then we got thrown into this fear matrix to where we were afraid of everything, and the only solution is to send combat troops everywhere. And that just became a default situation. And when you had the Iraq surge and you had the Afghan surge, and we have not broken out of that mindset right now. And so it just almost is like a default. Well, we have to have troops overseas to keep us safe. What we have to do, first of all, is penetrate that and realize, no, actually, we don't. We have a tremendous military capability, nuclear and conventional, that will keep us safe from virtually any threat that could arise today. And we have a good ISR strike to defend ourselves very effectively from terrorist attacks, no matter where they may come from. We have to realize we don't need those troops over there. That's not even keeping us safe, much less do we need to. Once we can come to the realization that that doesn't keep us safe, now then you can address a whole new realm of things and say, hey, what we need to do is focus on how are we going to benefit our country? Clearly, economic and diplomatic engagement is far more beneficial and helpful to our country than the barrel of the gun, leading with the barrel of the gun first. That's the worst way to do it. So if we can have a change of mentality, then that and many other things become possible.
I'll just piggyback on that. I think it was entirely understandable after 9/11, the United States suffered this horrific traumatic event, one of the worst certainly in our history, and it was understandable why people were extremely frightened and also believed that it was merely a harbinger of many other events like it. One of the great frustrations of my own is looking at the ensuing, nearly 18 years, and public attitudes in terms of fear of terrorism have basically not abated at all. If terrorism succeeds by terrorizing us, then the terrorists are winning because we're terrified. I'd like to see our counterterrorism measures writ large, sort of holistically. That should be one of the metrics. Are we less frightened than we were 18 years ago? Why do we not measure that? Why do we not account for that? Why do we not consider it a failure of policymakers to not reduce those fears? What they do instead is inflate them. And I think we need to reset our expectations in terms of what level of security is reasonable in a free society. Spoiler alert, it's not perfect security, but what we have is pretty darn good, and we need to stop frightening ourselves.
I remember vividly a chart that you guys produced at Cato. It essentially said, if I remember right, that you had the probability of being killed by a terrorist that you had similarly to being struck by lightning. And that was assessing data including 9/11, which was a traumatic event and a lot of casualties. But that shouldn't produce the fear factor we just heard described here, but I agree completely. It has still got a lot of people in its grip. And it's partly because politicians find it very handy to exploit the politics of fear. One more. Good. Up here. Go back to this side. She's had her hand up repeatedly.
Hi, I'm Netra Halpern with Peace Films. Also, I have a background in psychology. Is this echoing? Okay. Anyway, so I appreciate most of what everybody has said, and just want to reiterate that that fear-mongering is partly politicians, but it's also the mainstream media. And the media, the vast majority, is owned by only 6 companies. So we do not have a plurality of media like a strong, free, democratic state would. And so the question is, looking at terrorism, instead of just thinking that terrorists are like rats and you just have to kill them, and the more you kill, the more safe you'll be, to look at the socioeconomic situation that people are in, that they would join terrorist organizations, and to look at the U.S. Impact on global poverty. And is the U.S. more interested in asserting dominance, or is it more interested in having a prosperous world? And I would say that that is going to bring us the most security, is prosperity for people around the world, and of course in our own country. And your question? What are your comments on that idea?
I'll just pick up. Quite a few years ago now, Cato published a book, Terrorizing Ourselves, which included chapters exploring sort of the psychology of fear and sort of why it turns out human beings don't make good decisions when they're frightened. There's also a chapter in there about the relationship between poverty and terrorism. Let's just say it's complicated, because there are some people that are quite affluent who are radicalized, and others who are desperately poor who aren't. So it's quite complicated. But let me just reiterate that the extent to which fear-mongering is used as a vehicle for mobilizing support for various different political projects cannot be ignored, right? And so actually, we have a self-serving, I'll admit, Cato has a major project to try to put the various threats that are confronting this country into context, okay? And if we do that, we will, I think, discover that while there are certain things to be concerned about, it is not nearly to the extent that we are right now. We are scaring ourselves to death.
That's it?
All right, let's give another round of applause for the members of our panel.